This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for dynamic development and potential pawn breaks. This move symmetrically mirrors white's central pawn push, immediately contesting the vital e4 square and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for classical open game theory. This move, knight to f3, is a fundamental developing move that attacks black's e5 pawn and prepares for castling, adhering to classical opening principles. Developing a knight to c6 supports the e5 pawn and prepares for further central development, often leading to common opening structures like the Raul-Lopez or Italian game. This move initiates the Raul-Lopez, a classic opening that establishes central control and prepares to pressure black's knight, potentially leading to pawn structure weaknesses for black later in the game. This move, often called the Morphy defense, challenges the attacking bishop, forcing white to decide whether to exchange material or retreat, influencing the subsequent pawn structure and piece development. Black's a6 has forced white to make a decision about the bishop. 4. Ba4 is the most principled choice, maintaining the tension of the pin on the c6 knight and keeping open the possibility of retreating the bishop to c2 or b3 later if needed. Developing the knight to f6 is the most principled response in the Raul-Lopez, immediately attacking white's central pawn and continuing with black's natural development. Castling kingside secures the king behind a protective pawn shield and prepares to connect the rooks for future central or queenside play. Black captures the e4 pawn, entering a variation of the Raul-Lopez where white typically continues with d4 to challenge the central pawn. This move boldly challenges black's advanced knight and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to seize central space and initiative. This move, b5, actively challenges white's bishop on a4, forcing it to retreat and gaining space on the queenside, which is a standard counter-attacking idea in the Raul-Lopez open variation. This move retreats the bishop to a safe square, preparing to contest the d-file and maintain the tension after black's aggressive pawn advances. This move establishes central pawn control and challenges white's bishop, preparing to break open lines for piece activity and support the knight on e4. This capture opens the d-file, creating central tension and allowing white to develop their pieces more freely while challenging black's pawn structure. This move develops a piece and supports the central pawn advance while preparing to recapture the pawn on e5 with the bishop. This move aims to bolster the central pawn chain and prepare for queenside expansion by providing a solid pawn defense for the bishop on b3. This developing move logically prepares to castle, reinforces the center, and allows the e-pawn to advance later, consistent with standard Raul-Lopez structures. Developing the knight to d2 supports the e4 pawn and prepares to castle kingside, solidifying white's kingside pawn structure and developing another piece for active play. This move challenges white's central pawn and knight, aiming to clarify the pawn structure and potentially gain space on the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it supports the central pawn and eyes the queenside. This pawn thrust challenges white's center and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming to create dynamic play and potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure. This move, 12, Nay4, repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to control key squares and potentially attack black's vulnerable d4 pawn. This move initiates a tactical skirmish, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines for piece activity, though it sacrifices a pawn for immediate initiative. This move is a principled response to black's doubling of the c-pawns, aiming to clarify the pawn structure and regain central control by removing a key defender of the d4 square. Black recaptures the pawn, developing the bishop to an active central square while opening the c-file for future pressure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, controlling the central diagonal and supporting a potential kingside attack while also defending against immediate threats. This move develops the queen to a central square, connecting the rooks and preparing to castle queenside, while also defending the pawn on d4. This pawn recapture on c3 opens the b-file for white's rook and prepares to activate the queen by developing it to a more central square, aiming to contest black's active piece play. This move activates the rook, placing it on an open file and preparing to contest control of the d-file, potentially targeting white's central pawn structure or supporting a future pawn advance. This exchange simplifies the position, forcing the opponent to recapture with the king, which leads to the loss of castling rights and an exposed monarch in the center. This move simplifies the position by exchanging queens, leading to an endgame where white aims to exploit black's slightly weaker pawn structure on the queenside. The rook's placement on the d-file aims to control the open file and prepare for potential advances or pressure on black's queenside pawn structure after the recent exchanges. The knight retreats to b8 to avoid being exchanged and to prepare for a potential repositioning to c6 or d7, aiming to improve its defensive and offensive capabilities in the ensuing middle game. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest control of the d-file and potentially support a future pawn advance in the center. This move correctly repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing the weakened c3 pawn and supporting the knight's maneuver to f5. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the long diagonal, reinforcing the knight on d4 and preparing to contest control of the central d-file. Black recaptures the castled position, securing the king's safety and preparing to connect the rooks for future activity on the open files. The rook on d2 repositions to prepare for potential doubled rooks on the d-file, aiming to exert pressure on black's central pawns and prepare for pawn advances in the center. This move aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain central space by challenging the d4 pawn, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This knight move repositions the knight to control the central squares and potentially prepare a regrouping to a more active outpost on c5 or e5. Black repositions the rook to the semi-open c-file, preparing to contest control and potentially support a kingside pawn push with c4 later. The move 22, Rad1 is a logical reinforcement of the central file, preparing to contest the open d-file and support a potential pawn advance in the center or queenside. The move 22, bg4 is an attempt to contest the control of the central squares and disrupt white's knight mobility, particularly by threatening to exchange off white's active knight on d4, thus potentially improving black's piece coordination. This move, f3, is a prophylactic defense against the bishop on g4, preventing it from targeting weaknesses in white's kingside pawn structure and preparing to challenge the bishop with g4 later. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the crucial d5 square and potentially support a pawn advance on the queenside or center. This move, f4, aims to shore up the kingside pawn structure and prepare for a potential pawn advance or to support a knight maneuver to a more active square. This move prepares to develop the kingside bishop, potentially reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for a kingside pawn advance later. This move prevents black's bishop from activating further along the g4a8 diagonal and prepares for potential pawn breaks or piece maneuvering on the kingside. This move challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to disrupt white's coordination by creating an outpost for the knight on b3. The knight repositions to the central square d4, eyeing the weak pawn on c6 and preparing to attack the pinned e6 bishop, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially targeting white's queenside pawns and preparing to challenge the knights. The king repositions to a more active square, allowing the rook on d2 to potentially swing over to the kingside and supporting the knights advance to e4 while also preparing for potential pawn pushes later. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the d7h3 diagonal, potentially supporting a future kingside pawn advance or preparing to contest the open c-file if white plays a4. The knight repositions to c2, clearing the d4 square for a pawn push and preparing to potentially redeploy to the kingside or reinforce the queenside defense. This exchange simplifies the position, removing a key defender of white's knight on d4 and weakening black's pawn structure around the king. But it does allow black to centralize their remaining bishop. This move resolves the immediate tactical tension by forcing an exchange of kings, entering a slightly compromised king position for white but simplifying the material to a more manageable endgame given black's queenside pawn majority. Black's move *bc6** is a solid defensive maneuver, reinforcing the c5 square and preparing to challenge white's knight on d4 should it advance further, while also eyeing potential counterplay on the d-file. This rook move targets the weak c4 pawn and aims to exploit the open d-file, potentially leading to increased pressure on black's position and creating opportunities for tactical combinations. This move aims to centralize the rook, preparing to contest the open c-file and support a potential advance of the c-pawn. This move reroutes the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn push c4 and potentially target weaknesses on black's queenside. Trading the bishop for the knight on e4 simplifies black's position and clarifies the pawn structure on the queenside, but it also gives white a strong passed pawn on the d-file. The king's recapture is essential to consolidate white's material advantage and prepare for the endgame, now that queens are off the board. The move 32, a5 is a proactive pawn thrust designed to challenge white's advanced knight on b4 and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest the d5 square and potentially support a kingside attack or exploit any weaknesses on the queenside. This move intends to secure the rook on the 7th rank, which is often a strong outpost, while also potentially preparing to challenge white's dominant knight on d5 or offer a trade if white is not careful. This move supports the central pawn push b4, aiming to restrict black's pieces and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square where it can support the pawn push and potentially swing over to the kingside if needed. This move effectively centralizes the rook on a strong open file, pressuring black's pawns and restricting their piece mobility while simultaneously preparing to advance the queenside pawns. This move activates the rook to contest the open file and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside. This move sacrifices the knight to open up the king's file and create a decisive mating attack. This move is a necessary repositioning to protect the king and prepare for potential counterplay on the king's side, as the knight on b4 is currently under attack. This move seeks to activate the rook on the 7th rank, preparing to double rooks on the d-file or potentially swing over to the king side, aiming to exploit white's pawn weaknesses and restrict black's king. This move boldly pushes the b-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pieces, gain space on the queen side, and potentially create a passed pawn if white captures. Capturing the pawn on a4 opens the a-file and forces black to react to the immediate threat, disrupting their coordination. This pawn advances to challenge white's central control and open a file for black's rook, creating dynamic counterplay on the queen side. This move, rxa6, wins material by exploiting the undefended rook on a7, creating a significant material advantage for white. This move offers counterplay by repositioning the rook to an active file, aiming to exploit white's exposed king and potentially create threats on the 7th rank. Rab6 aims to utilize the open b-file to exert pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create threats against the b-pawn and beyond.